Some cities are so old that history itself forgets them. Beneath the desert heat of the Jordan Valley lies Jericho, a settlement older than the pyramids, older than written language, and possibly older than any city humanity still remembers by name. For more than 10,000 years, people return to this single oasis beside a spring, building walls, burying their dead beneath their homes, and surviving collapse after collapse while entire civilizations disappeared around them. But how did one small settlement become the foundation of urban life itself? And why does almost nobody talk about it today? Before we go deeper into the oldest city on Earth, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy mysterious history, ancient civilizations, and the forgotten stories buried beneath our world. At sunrise, the Jordan Valley looks almost empty. The land around it appears exhausted by heat and age, a wide basin of pale stone and dry wind sitting far below sea level. The hills are bare for long stretches. Dust drifts across old roads. Salt gathers in the air from the nearby Dead Sea. Nothing about the landscape immediately suggests that one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on Earth lies here, hidden beneath a mound of debris created by thousands of years of human survival. Yet beneath that mound are entire forgotten worlds. Stone tools rest under collapsed walls. Human burials lie beneath ancient house floors. Burned grain still survives in sealed layers of ash. Whole communities rose here, vanished here, and were buried here long before the first pharaoh ruled Egypt, long before the pyramids appeared above the desert, long before the first known alphabet or empire or written law. While names like Babylon, Athens, and Rome dominate popular imagination, the settlement at Jericho reaches back into a period so distant that even the idea of a city barely exists. And still, people came here, again and again. The mound itself, known today as Tel es-Sultan, does not look dramatic from a distance. It rises gently from the valley floor, shaped not by nature alone but by repetition. Every generation built on top of the remains of another. Walls collapsed, roofs burned, mud brick dissolved in rain and heat. New families flattened the ruins and built again. Over centuries, then millennia, the settlement slowly lifted itself upward, layer by layer, until the ground became a vertical archive of human persistence. Archaeologists digging into the mound found something unsettling about its depth. The deeper they went, the stranger time became. Familiar civilizations disappeared first. Roman traces gave way to older remains. Bronze Age cities vanished beneath Iron Age rubble. Then even the Bronze Age fell away. Pottery styles changed. Architecture simplified. Writing disappeared entirely. Eventually the excavators reached layers so ancient that they belonged to a world before recorded history. And still there were walls, still there were houses, still there were human beings trying to stay alive in one small patch of green surrounded by harsh land. What survives in the record suggests that Jericho may have begun as early as 10,000 years ago, perhaps even earlier depending on how one defines permanent settlement. Scholars still debate the exact boundaries between a village, a proto-city, and a true urban centre. But Jericho repeatedly forces historians to reconsider those definitions. The site does not fit neatly into older assumptions about how civilization was supposed to begin. For generations, many historians imagined early humans following a simple sequence. First came wandering hunters, then farming villages, then towns, then cities, then organized states and monumental construction. Jericho complicates that narrative. Some of its massive structures appear astonishingly early. emerging before many scholars once believed complex collective labour should even have been possible. The place feels almost out of time. The valley surrounding Jericho also contributes to the sensation. The settlement lies near one of the oldest reliable freshwater springs in the region. In a landscape where survival could depend entirely on seasonal rainfall, the spring created an island of stability. Palm trees could grow here. Wild grains appeared nearby. Animals gathered around water sources. Humans did the same. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Long before the first city walls rose, small bands of hunter-gatherers likely passed through the region seasonally. They hunted gazelle across the grasslands that once spread wider than today. They collected wild cereals. They watched shifting weather patterns carefully because climate controlled everything. At the end of the last ice age, the environment across the Near East was changing rapidly. Temperatures warmed. Rainfall shifted north and south unpredictably. Some regions became greener for a time, others dried out. Human communities adapted constantly. In most places, survival required movement. People travelled with animal migrations or seasonal plants. Permanent settlement carried enormous risks. Staying in one place too long could exhaust nearby resources or expose a community to drought. Yet Jericho offered something rare enough to challenge that older rhythm. Water flowed consistently here. Even during difficult seasons, the spring remained. The importance of that cannot be overstated. Fresh water did not simply support life, it changed human behaviour, it altered time itself. Instead of organising existence around movement, people could begin organising existence around return. Families revisited the same ground repeatedly. Temporary camps slowly became semi-permanent shelters. Those shelters expanded. Storage pits appeared. Food preparation became more organised. Over generations, memory attached itself to location. This mattered psychologically as much as materially. A wandering camp leaves little behind. A permanent home changes the relationship between humans and death, ancestry, territory, and labour. Once people remain in one place long enough to bury their dead beneath the same ground they sleep on, entirely new social pressures emerge. Ownership begins to matter. Boundaries matter. Storage matters. Protection matters. The archaeological record at Jericho preserves traces of these transformations in unusually early form. Excavators found circular houses in some of the earliest layers, built from mud brick shaped by hand and dried beneath the sun. The structures appear modest at first glance, but together they represent a profound shift in human history. Building durable homes requires planning beyond immediate survival. It demands cooperation, maintenance, and some expectation that tomorrow will resemble today. That expectation may sound ordinary now, but for prehistoric humans it represented a major gamble. No single explanation fully accounts for why Jericho succeeded where countless other settlements vanished quickly. Geography helped. Water helped. Climate fluctuations may have concentrated populations around dependable springs. Social traditions likely reinforced return to the site. Once a settlement reached a certain size, cooperation itself became a survival advantage. More people meant greater labour capacity, shared knowledge, and protection. But larger populations also created new dangers. Crowding encouraged disease. Stored food attracted pests. Competition intensified. Social hierarchies may have begun emerging. Some scholars believe the earliest forms of organised authority developed partly through managing resources and coordinating labour in places exactly like Jericho. The evidence remains incomplete, but the settlement clearly demanded increasingly complex cooperation over time. And all of this unfolded in a world without writing. No king recorded these events. No priest carved triumphs into stone. No chronicler described the founding of the settlement or the fears of its inhabitants. Everything known about early Jericho comes from fragments buried beneath thousands of years of collapse. Broken tools, seeds, bones, post holes, ash layers. Human remains carefully positioned beneath floors. The silence surrounding the site makes it feel older than history itself. At night, the valley becomes very still. Wind moves softly across the ruins. Beyond the settlement, the desert stretches outward into darkness. Somewhere beneath the mound rest the remains of people who lived at the threshold between movement and permanence, between the old human world and something entirely new. They did not know they were helping create the foundations of civilization. They were trying to eat, survive droughts, protect families, and endure another season beside a spring in the middle of an unforgiving landscape. Yet from those decisions, repeated over centuries, one of humanity's oldest cities slowly emerged. For most of human existence, cities do not exist. Kingdoms do not exist. Borders, monuments, written laws, standing armies, marketplaces, and organized religions in their later forms all belong to a surprisingly recent chapter of the human story. The overwhelming majority of prehistoric people move constantly through landscapes that are both generous and dangerous, following seasonal rhythms older than memory itself. The world surrounding early Jericho still belongs largely to that older age. The Great Ice Age is ending, but its effects linger everywhere. Glaciers continue retreating far to the north. Sea levels slowly rise. Vast climatic systems shift unpredictably across continents. In the Near East, grasslands spread across regions that are now far drier. Herds of gazelle move through open terrain in astonishing numbers. Wild barley and wheat grow naturally in certain valleys. Rivers swell and shrink according to changing rainfall patterns. Human groups travel through this world lightly, carrying tools, hunting weapons, baskets, animal skins, and inherited knowledge about where food and water can still be found. Nothing about these communities is primitive in the simplistic sense often imagined by later societies. They understand animal behavior intimately. They recognize edible plants across enormous territories. They track weather through subtle environmental changes almost invisible to modern eyes. Their survival depends on memory passed across generations with remarkable precision. But their lives remain fragile. One failed migration can bring starvation. One severe drought can scatter entire communities. An injury far from reliable shelter may become fatal. Human beings at this stage of history are highly adaptable, yet they remain deeply exposed to nature's instability. This is why places like Jericho become so important. Stability itself is rare enough to transform behavior. Long before permanent architecture dominates the settlement, people likely gather seasonally around the spring. Archaeological evidence from the wider region suggests that hunter-gatherer groups increasingly return to reliable resource zones during this transitional period. The Natufian culture, often associated with some of the earliest semi-sedentary communities in the Levant, appears across several sites during roughly this era. These people still hunt extensively, especially gazelle. But they also intensify their collection of wild grains and begin investing more heavily in fixed locations. What survives in the record suggests an unusual tension emerging inside human life. People are still mobile, but less completely mobile than before. They travel, but often within smaller seasonal ranges. They construct shelters designed to last longer. They store food. They revisit burial grounds. In subtle ways, the emotional geography of humanity begins changing. Home becomes more permanent. At Jericho, The spring creates a center of gravity. Even groups that continue moving through the region may use the settlement as a predictable gathering point. Seasonal aggregation changes social life dramatically. Larger groups allow greater exchange of ideas, tools, and marriage partners. Ceremonies become more elaborate. Shared traditions strengthen. At the same time, concentration of population creates new tensions that mobile life once dispersed naturally. There are hints of all this buried beneath the site. Grinding stones appear in significant numbers, suggesting increasing reliance on processed grains. Sickle blades used for harvesting cereals show microscopic wear patterns from cutting plants repeatedly. Storage pits indicate planning far beyond immediate consumption. Human labor is slowly reorganizing itself around delayed rewards. Instead of consuming everything immediately, communities begin thinking in terms of future scarcity. This mental shift may be one of the most important revolutions in human history. A mobile hunter-gatherer society can remain highly sophisticated without storing large surpluses. But once food storage expands, entirely new possibilities emerge. Stored grain can support larger populations. Larger populations require coordination. Coordination encourages leadership roles, whether formal or informal. Property becomes increasingly meaningful because survival now depends partly on accumulated resources rather than only daily success. Yet this transition is neither smooth nor inevitable. Scholars still debate exactly how agriculture emerged in places like Jericho. Older theories once imagined humans consciously inventing farming in a sudden leap forward. The evidence now suggests something slower and messier. People likely experimented with plant management gradually while still hunting and gathering extensively. Wild cereals became more important over generations rather than overnight. Cultivation may have begun accidentally through repeated harvesting and seed dispersal near settlements. The process unfolds across centuries difficult to measure precisely. Meanwhile, the climate continues changing. Around 12,900 years ago, a severe climatic event known as the Younger Dryas interrupts the warming trend that followed the Ice Age. Temperatures drop again in many regions. Conditions become colder and drier. Some scholars believe this event placed enormous pressure on human communities already becoming more dependent on localized resources. The evidence remains incomplete. But environmental stress may have accelerated the move toward cultivation and permanent settlement in certain areas. Jericho survives through this unstable period, though survival does not necessarily mean comfort. Life near the settlement likely becomes harder in some phases. Hunting patterns shift. Water access becomes even more critical. Food shortages may have intensified competition between groups, yet the spring continues flowing, and that continuity matters. In difficult climates, dependable water becomes almost magnetic. Over time, temporary shelters become sturdier. Circular structures made from mud brick and stone foundations spread across the site. Floors are carefully prepared. Hearths appear in consistent locations. Tools accumulate. The settlement begins acquiring density. Instead of a passing camp, Jericho increasingly resembles a community rooted physically and psychologically in one place. The implications extend far beyond architecture. Once people stay together longer, they begin confronting social problems unfamiliar to highly mobile groups. Waste accumulates. Disputes over resources become more persistent because individuals cannot simply move away easily. Population growth intensifies demands on nearby land. Labor specialization may slowly emerge. Some individuals become more skilled at toolmaking, others at food preparation, others at construction. The archaeological record preserves only fragments of these relationships, but the settlement scale suggests increasingly organized communal life. There is also another subtle transformation underway. Time itself becomes layered differently. Mobile groups experience landscapes cyclically through migration routes and seasonal returns. Permanent settlements create cumulative history. Buildings remain standing long enough to carry memory. Ancestors become associated with specific locations. Childhood unfolds in familiar streets and structures rather than constantly changing campsites. This attachment to place changes how humans think. Burials from early Jericho hint at this growing connection between living communities and their dead. Some individuals are interred beneath house floors, physically remaining inside domestic space after death. The practice suggests powerful ideas about ancestry, continuity, and belonging. A settlement is no longer merely shelter, it becomes identity. No written myths survive from these people, but their actions leave traces of emotional worlds already becoming surprisingly complex. Meanwhile, beyond Jericho, much of humanity still lives according to older patterns. Across enormous stretches of Earth, people continue moving seasonally through forests, coastlines, tundra, and grasslands. Cities remain unimaginable to them. Even Jericho itself is not yet a city in the later sense. There are no palaces here, no temples towering above streets, no royal dynasties. But something unprecedented is taking shape. The settlement is becoming an experiment in permanence, one that human beings have rarely attempted before at this scale. Every season that families remain beside the spring increases investment in the site. Every wall repaired, every burial completed, every storage pit filled pushes the community further away from older ways of life. And once that transformation begins, reversing it becomes difficult. The valley still looks quiet from a distance. Palm trees sway lightly near water. Smoke rises from hearths. Children move between mud brick homes. Hunters leave before dawn. Grain dries beneath the sun. Yet beneath these ordinary routines, humanity is crossing an invisible threshold. The old world of constant movement is slowly giving way to a new relationship with land, memory, labor, and survival. Jericho stands directly on that boundary. The spring at Jericho does not announce itself dramatically. It emerges quietly from the earth, clear water flowing upward through stone into one of the driest inhabited regions on the planet. In the modern world, where pipes and reservoirs conceal the origins of water, it is easy to underestimate the force such a spring could exert over prehistoric life. But in the ancient Jordan Valley, dependable fresh water is not simply useful. It determines where human beings can exist at all. Without the spring, Jericho almost certainly never forms. The oasis creates a pocket of fertility surrounded by increasingly harsh terrain. Date palms grow here. Reeds cluster near wet ground. Wild cereals flourish in nearby zones during favourable climatic periods. Animals gather predictably around water sources, and where animals gather, hunters follow. Even before permanent settlement fully develops, the spring transforms the valley into a natural stopping point in a difficult landscape. Yet over time, the relationship between humans and the oasis changes. The people who return here seasonally begin shaping the environment itself. Vegetation is cleared deliberately, paths form between structures, refuse accumulates. Seeds from useful plants spread unintentionally through repeated harvesting and habitation. Dogs may already accompany human groups by this period, helping with protection and hunting. The boundary between natural oasis and human-created settlement becomes harder to separate. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that by around 8,500 BCE, Jericho has grown into something extraordinary for its age. Population estimates vary widely because evidence from such distant periods remains incomplete. But some scholars believe several hundred people, perhaps more during certain phases, may have occupied the settlement. That number may sound small today, yet in the prehistoric world it represents an unusually dense concentration of human life. Density changes everything. In small mobile bands, conflict can often be avoided through movement. In permanent settlements, tension accumulates. Food must be shared or defended. Labor must be coordinated. Water access becomes central to survival. Children grow up surrounded not only by family but by unrelated individuals living nearby year after year. Human beings are suddenly forced into new forms of social negotiation. Jericho may be one of the first places where humanity truly confronts the pressures of living together permanently. The spring itself demands organization. Water must remain accessible. Paths to the source require maintenance. Storage systems become increasingly important as populations rise. Some researchers believe early irrigation practices may have developed gradually around the oasis, though evidence for precise methods remains debated. What seems more certain is that people here are becoming deeply skilled at extracting stability from a fragile environment. The settlement's architecture reflects this adaptation. Early homes are often circular, constructed from mud brick placed upon stone foundations. The walls curve inward gently, supporting roofs made from timber, reeds, and packed earth. Inside, floors are carefully smoothed with plaster-like surfaces. Hearths provide warmth and cooking space. Storage bins hold grain gathered from nearby fields or wild stands. Life unfolds close to the ground, inside enclosed spaces that create both security and confinement. The emotional consequences of permanent housing are difficult to reconstruct fully, yet they may have been profound. Humans who once slept beneath temporary shelters now wake inside structures built to endure. Children are born into houses their parents expect to maintain for years. The settlement acquires continuity. People begin inheriting not only tools and knowledge, but physical space. And with permanence comes vulnerability. A mobile community facing danger can leave. A permanent settlement carries weight. Stored food cannot easily be transported. Buildings anchor populations psychologically and materially. Jericho's inhabitants are increasingly committed to remaining beside the spring, even when conditions become difficult. The climate around them does not remain stable for long. The younger Dryas continues affecting the broader region during part of Jericho's early development. Rainfall patterns fluctuate. Some areas become less reliable for wild cereals. Hunting conditions shift. Scholars still debate the exact environmental pressures operating in the Jordan Valley during these centuries, but evidence across the Near East suggests communities are adapting to increasingly unpredictable circumstances. This may help explain one of the most important developments in human history, the gradual emergence of agriculture. At Jericho, archaeologists discovered evidence suggesting intensive grain use long before fully developed farming systems dominate the region. The distinction matters. Early cultivation is not identical to later agriculture. People likely continue hunting extensively while experimenting with planting, harvesting, and managing useful species. Wild and domesticated forms overlap for generations. Human beings do not suddenly become farmers overnight. Instead, necessity and opportunity slowly reshape behavior. The spring allows experimentation because it reduces certain risks. Reliable water provides a buffer against environmental instability. If cultivated plants fail one season, hunting and gathering may still supplement survival. Over centuries, however, the balance shifts. Cultivation becomes increasingly attractive because it produces concentrated food supplies near permanent homes. Yet farming also traps people more tightly to place. Fields require protection and maintenance. Harvest cycles structure the calendar. Surplus food encourages population growth, which in turn demands more food. The system feeds itself. Jericho's growth may partly reflect this feedback loop, emerging in one of the earliest settled communities known to archaeology. What makes the site especially remarkable is how early these developments appear. In many older models of history, monumental construction and large communal labour projects were expected to emerge only after agriculture became fully established and hierarchical states developed. Jericho challenges those assumptions repeatedly. Even before later civilizations rise elsewhere, the settlement already displays signs of organized cooperation on a surprising scale. And beneath all of it remains the spring. Day after day, year after year, water continues flowing from the earth while generations live and die beside it. Infants who drink from the oasis become elders buried beneath house floors decades later. Buildings are repaired continuously. Pathways deepen under countless footsteps. Smoke stains roofs black. Grain dust settles into cracks in plaster floors. Dogs bark at night beyond the settlement edge where darkness opens into the valley. The ordinary routines of survival slowly accumulate into history. There are also signs that Jericho's inhabitants understand the fragility of their position. The surrounding landscape can still become hostile quickly. Flash floods occasionally strike the valley. Droughts remain possible. Competition over resources may intensify as nearby populations grow. No single explanation fully accounts for how Jericho maintains continuity across such long periods, but adaptability appears central to its survival. The people here are not passive recipients of environmental fortune. They reshape the oasis constantly through labour. Stone tools recovered from the site reveal increasing sophistication in food preparation and construction work. Blades are carefully crafted. Grinding stones become worn smooth through years of use. Storage technologies improve. Animal bones show changing hunting patterns over time. Each artifact preserves evidence of a community learning how to remain in one place, despite pressures that once forced human groups to move continuously. And perhaps most importantly, memory begins attaching itself to the land in unprecedented ways. The spring is no longer merely water, it becomes inheritance. Ancestors once walked these same paths to fill containers and wash tools. The dead lie buried beneath nearby houses. Children grow up hearing stories tied to specific places within the settlement. Human identity becomes anchored physically to geography. That transformation may be one of the deepest revolutions in all of human history. Civilization does not begin suddenly with kings or armies or writing. It begins quietly, with repeated return to a dependable spring in a dangerous landscape. It begins when enough people decide, consciously or not, that remaining together beside one source of water is worth the risks permanence creates. At Jericho, that decision changes the future of humanity. At first glance, the tower should not exist. It rises from the ancient layers of Jericho with a kind of impossible confidence. Built from heavy stone blocks arranged by human hands nearly 11,000 years ago, even now, after erosion and collapse have reduced much of its original form, the structure remains unsettling. It belongs to an era when metallurgy barely exists, when pottery has not yet become widespread, when organized kingdoms and written bureaucracies are still thousands of years in the future. And yet someone builds this. The tower stands attached to a massive stone wall encircling part of the settlement. Together they represent one of the earliest known large-scale construction projects in human history. Archaeologists uncovered the remains during excavations in the 20th century, and the discovery immediately challenged older assumptions about prehistoric society. According to many earlier theories, only complex states with rulers, taxation, and formal hierarchies should have been capable of organizing labor on this scale. Jericho forces an uncomfortable revision. The wall itself originally stretches several meters high and is constructed from stone gathered and transported without wheeled vehicles, draft animals, or metal tools. Beside it rises the tower, perhaps 8 or 9 meters tall in its original state, with an internal staircase leading upward through carefully fitted masonry. Even today, the surviving structure carries a strange physical presence. It does not resemble random accumulation or casual building. It reflects planning, cooperation, and enormous labor investment. The question is why? Scholars still debate the purpose of the wall and tower because no single explanation fully accounts for the evidence. Older interpretations focused heavily on defense. A wall surrounding a settlement naturally suggests fear of attack. Permanent communities create resources worth stealing: stored grain, water access, livestock, tools, shelter. As human groups become more settled, territorial conflict may intensify. But Jericho's wall complicates that simple narrative. Some researchers argue the structure may have served partly as flood control rather than pure defense. Seasonal water surges moving through the valley could damage lower settlements severely. The wall's placement and construction might have helped protect homes and storage areas from erosion or sudden floods descending from nearby highlands. Others suggest the structure performed multiple functions simultaneously. A wall can deter enemies while also managing environmental threats. Then there is the tower itself. Its sheer size suggests symbolic importance beyond practicality alone. Some archaeologists have proposed astronomical or ceremonial functions. One theory suggests the tower aligns with the setting sun during the summer solstice when viewed against nearby mountains, though scholars continue debating whether this alignment is intentional or coincidental. The evidence remains uncertain, yet even uncertainty reveals something important. The builders were thinking on scales larger than immediate survival. Constructing the tower demands coordinated labor over extended periods. Stone must be quarried, transported, shaped, and positioned carefully. Workers require food while construction continues. Planning becomes essential. Someone organizes effort, whether through formal leadership, communal ritual obligation, or social cooperation still poorly understood. This is what makes Jericho so difficult to classify. The settlement predates many traditional markers of civilization, yet already displays behaviors associated with much later urban societies. Collective labor projects emerge astonishingly early. Monumental architecture appears before pottery becomes common. Social organization grows increasingly sophisticated without leaving behind written records explaining itself. The silence surrounding the tower makes it even more powerful. No inscription survives naming its builders. No ruler claims credit. No priest explains its symbolism. Modern observers are left staring at stone placed by people whose voices vanished thousands of years before recorded history began. Still, the structure speaks indirectly. The staircase inside the tower is especially revealing. Its carefully designed steps suggest repeated human movement upward into the structure rather than simple solid construction. People climb this tower regularly. They carry objects upward. They gather there. Perhaps they watch the valley from above. Perhaps ceremonies unfold at its summit. Perhaps leaders stand there addressing the settlement below. Scholars still debate these possibilities because the evidence remains incomplete. But the architecture clearly shapes human behavior intentionally. Jericho's inhabitants are no longer merely adapting to nature. They are transforming the landscape physically and psychologically. The wall changes how the settlement feels from inside. Boundaries become visible. There is now an interior and exterior in a new sense. Safety exists within the enclosure. Unknown dangers remain beyond it, even if the wall functions partly against floods. Its symbolic effect matters. Human beings are separating controlled space from uncontrolled wilderness. This division becomes fundamental to later civilization. Inside the settlement, life grows denser and more structured. Houses cluster tightly together. Paths narrow between buildings. Food storage expands. Human waste accumulates. Smoke hangs above rooftops. Dogs move through crowded spaces searching for scraps. Children grow up surrounded by walls and neighbours rather than open migratory landscapes. The psychological world of Jericho is changing rapidly. Generations raised within permanent architecture may begin perceiving movement differently from their ancestors. Earlier hunter-gatherers understood land through routes and seasons. Jericho's inhabitants increasingly understand land through ownership, enclosure, and defense. The wall reflects not only physical labor, but a new mental relationship with territory. And territory creates conflict. Evidence for organized warfare this early remains debated across many prehistoric sites, including Jericho itself. Archaeology rarely preserves violence clearly unless destruction layers or skeletal injuries survive. Some researchers caution against projecting later warfare backward onto these communities too easily. Others argue competition over water and resources almost certainly existed once permanent settlements emerged. What seems undeniable is that Jericho's people feel vulnerable enough to invest enormous effort into collective protection of some kind. That vulnerability may stem partly from success itself. As the settlement grows, it becomes increasingly difficult to abandon. Mobile groups can escape environmental stress through movement. Jericho cannot relocate easily. Its people are tied materially and emotionally to the oasis. The wall may therefore represent anxiety as much as confidence. Civilization's earliest monuments are perhaps born partly from fear. There is another striking detail buried within the archaeology of the tower. The builders possess no metal tools. Everything is accomplished with stone, wood, bone, fiber, and human muscle. The labor required becomes almost unimaginable by modern standards. Stones weighing hundreds of kilograms must be maneuvered through coordinated effort alone. Construction likely unfolds slowly over years. Yet they persist. This persistence reveals something profound about human cooperation. Large-scale communal projects do not necessarily require centralized empires. Shared belief, environmental pressure, social obligation, or ritual meaning may motivate equally ambitious labor. Jericho demonstrates that prehistoric societies are capable of organization far more complex than older stereotypes once allowed. The tower also changes the settlement visually. For perhaps the first time in human history, a truly monumental structure rises above ordinary domestic life in a permanent community. It alters the skyline. Travelers approaching the oasis see something unmistakably human dominating the landscape. A statement has been made here. We are staying. That message matters because permanence remains unusual in this era. Across much of the world, human groups still move seasonally through forests, coastlines, and plains. Jericho instead anchors itself physically to the earth with stone. The tower embodies confidence in continuity, even while climate instability and uncertainty continue shaping daily existence. Night must have looked different after its construction. Firelight flickers against stone walls, shadows stretch across packed earth paths. The tower rises above sleeping houses while wind moves through the valley beyond the settlement edge. Somewhere nearby, the spring continues flowing in darkness, the quiet force sustaining everything. Beneath the stars, the people of Jericho live inside one of humanity's first true experiments in collective permanence. And for reasons scholars still cannot fully explain, they are building on a scale the prehistoric world has rarely seen before. Inside the settlement, life is crowded, repetitive, exhausting, and deeply intimate. The houses of early Jericho stand close together, their mud brick walls pressed into irregular clusters around narrow open spaces where people cook, repair tools, dry grain, and move through the routines of survival. From above, the settlement would look less like a planned city and more like an organism growing slowly across the oasis floor. Structures expand, collapse, and are rebuilt in patterns shaped by necessity rather than geometry. Yet despite the apparent simplicity, daily life here demands constant labour. Morning begins before the worst heat arrives. Smoke rises from hearths as grain is prepared for grinding. Stone querns scrape rhythmically for hours, reducing barley or wheat into coarse flour. The work is physically punishing. Archaeologists studying prehistoric skeletons across early agricultural communities often find heavy wear in joints and bones, particularly among women, whose bodies bear the repetitive strain of grinding grain day after day over many years. Civilization begins with aching backs as much as monuments. Food preparation consumes enormous amounts of time. Grain must be harvested, dried, cleaned, stored, protected from moisture, then processed manually before cooking. Wild plants supplement diets when available. Lentils and other early cultivated foods appear increasingly often. Hunting still matters greatly, especially in Jericho's earlier phases. Gazelle bones are common in the archaeological record, suggesting organized hunting remains essential even as farming expands. The settlement smells of smoke, damp earth, sweat, animals, and stored grain. Dogs wander between houses searching for scraps. Insects gather near refuse pits. Water carried from the spring splashes onto dusty ground and evaporates quickly beneath the valley heat. The people living here are not abstract pioneers of civilization. They are human beings managing hunger, illness, childbirth, injury, weather, and social tension within increasingly confined space. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that Jericho's homes gradually evolve over time. Earlier circular houses eventually give way in many phases to rectangular structures. This architectural shift may appear minor, but it reflects changing ideas about space and organization. Rectangular rooms allow more efficient arrangement beside one another. They create clearer divisions between activities. Storage becomes easier. Expansion becomes more systematic. The settlement itself is learning how to become denser. Inside the homes, floors are often carefully plastered and maintained. Some surfaces are surprisingly smooth and refined, showing that aesthetic care exists alongside practical necessity. Hearths occupy central positions. Storage bins line walls. Roofs likely require continual repair due to weather and decay. Timber is valuable in this environment, and building materials must be reused whenever possible. There's little privacy by modern standards. Families live close together, often across generations. Sound travels easily through mud brick walls. Illness spreads quickly in dense settlements. Scholars studying early agricultural communities frequently note that permanent settlement brings significant health costs despite increased food production. Diets become less varied. Crowding encourages disease transmission. Dependence on crops creates vulnerability to failure. The evidence from Jericho suggests both improvement and hardship, unfolding simultaneously. Children born into the settlement experience a world very different from that of fully mobile hunter-gatherers. They grow up surrounded by architecture and routine. They learn pathways through familiar structures. They recognize neighbors permanently rather than seasonally. Their memories attach to specific houses, specific walls, specific corners near hearths and storage pits. This rootedness changes human psychology in ways difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. The dead remain close as well. Burials beneath house floors become one of the settlement's most haunting characteristics. Bodies are interred beneath domestic space, sometimes directly under areas where families continue living afterward. Ancestors are not separated into distant cemeteries. They remain physically integrated into everyday life. The emotional meaning of this practice is still debated. Some scholars believe it reinforces claims to household continuity and territory. Others emphasize spiritual or ancestral reverence. What survives in the record suggests both practical and symbolic dimensions intertwine. The home becomes more than shelter. It becomes a place where generations accumulate physically beneath the feet of the living. At night, people sleep above their dead. Jericho's inhabitants also begin interacting with objects differently than earlier societies. Permanent settlement encourages accumulation. Tools are stored rather than constantly transported. Grinding stones become too heavy for mobility. Construction materials remain fixed in place. Over time, households acquire increasing physical investment in location. This investment creates stability but also dependence. A failed harvest now threatens not only immediate survival but the entire structure of settled life. Food shortages become more dangerous in some ways because populations are larger and less flexible. Evidence across many early farming communities suggests malnutrition can increase during certain phases of agricultural transition. Jericho's people are building a new world, but it is not automatically easier than the old one. The settlement likely experiences periods of tension and scarcity regularly. Drought years reduce nearby productivity, hunting conditions fluctuate, storage systems fail occasionally. Flash floods threaten lower areas of the oasis. No single explanation fully accounts for how Jericho maintains continuity across centuries, but resilience clearly becomes one of its defining traits. Human cooperation grows increasingly necessary. Large populations require systems of shared labor. Whether formalized or not, water access must remain functional. Construction projects need coordination. Harvesting demands collective effort during critical seasons. Social pressure likely enforces participation long before written laws exist. Some archaeologists believe early social inequality may already be emerging subtly within communities like Jericho. Certain burials appear more elaborate than others. Some households may control greater resources or occupy more advantageous positions within the settlement. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars continue debating how hierarchical these societies truly become. But permanent communities naturally create opportunities for unequal access to labor, food, and prestige. Even so, Jericho still lacks the dramatic stratification visible in much later civilizations. There are no palaces towering above common homes, no royal tombs overflowing with treasure. If leadership exists here, it likely operates through ritual authority, kinship influence, or control over communal labor rather than formal kingship. And beneath everything remains the constant work of survival. People repair walls damaged by weather. They patch roofs before seasonal rains. They sharpen stone blades dulled by harvests. Mothers care for infants while smoke fills enclosed rooms. Hunters leave before dawn carrying spears tipped with carefully shaped points. Elderly individuals, their joints worn from decades of labour, sit near house entrances repairing baskets or sorting grain. The settlement breathes through repetition. There are moments of beauty as well. Sunlight reflects from wet plaster floors after cleaning. Palm trees move gently above the oasis. Grain dries golden beneath the heat. Shared meals create rhythms of belonging impossible during constant migration. Children play between houses while elders tell stories whose contents vanished forever from history. None of these people know they are living inside one of humanity's earliest urban experiments. To them, Jericho is simply the world they inherited beside the spring. But the archaeological layers preserve something larger. They capture humanity learning, painfully and gradually, how to live permanently together. Every repaired wall, every buried ancestor, every grinding stone worn smooth by years of labour marks another step away from the older nomadic world. Civilization is not appearing suddenly here. It is accumulating slowly through ordinary life. The skulls appear long after the flesh is gone. Archaeologists uncover them carefully beneath the floors of ancient houses at Jericho, hidden among layers of collapsed mud brick and compacted earth. At first they seem like ordinary human remains, one more burial among many in a settlement already filled with the dead. But then the details emerge. The lower jaws have been removed deliberately. Faces have been rebuilt with plaster. Shells are inserted where eyes once existed. Features are modelled carefully by human hands long after death. The effect is deeply unsettling. Even today, the reconstructed faces feel strangely alive, suspended somewhere between portrait and relic. They stare outward from the prehistoric world with hollow expressions shaped nearly 10,000 years ago. No writing survives to explain them. No myths accompany the burials. The people who created these objects vanished before recorded history began, leaving only these silent faces beneath the houses of Jericho. And yet the skulls reveal something profound. They suggest that early settled life is transforming not only economics and architecture, but humanity's relationship with memory, ancestry, and death itself. In highly mobile societies, the dead are often left behind as groups continue moving through seasonal landscapes. Permanent settlement changes this dynamic completely. Once people remain in one place across generations, ancestors become physically tied to specific homes and territories. The dead remain present. Burial grounds accumulate. Memory acquires geography. At Jericho, that connection becomes intimate in ways modern observers still struggle to interpret fully. Bodies are commonly buried beneath house floors shortly after death, in some cases, after decomposition occurs. Skulls are removed from the skeletons and altered carefully with plaster and shell decoration. Similar practices appear at several Neolithic sites across the Levant. But Jericho contains some of the most famous examples. Scholars still debate exactly what these skulls represent because the evidence remains incomplete. One theory suggests ancestor veneration. The preserved faces may have served as memorials to important family members or community leaders whose presence continued symbolically within the household. Another interpretation emphasizes social continuity. In newly permanent settlements, ancestry becomes increasingly tied to rights over land, resources, and identity. Preserving the dead physically may reinforce claims of belonging and inheritance. There are also more spiritual possibilities. Some researchers believe the skulls reflect emerging religious ideas tied to fertility, protection, or household ritual. Others caution against imposing later concepts of organized religion onto societies that likely understood the world through very different frameworks. What survives in the record suggests symbolic behavior growing increasingly elaborate. but the precise meaning remains uncertain. The uncertainty itself matters. These people are living during a period when human consciousness about permanence may be changing rapidly. Once communities settle permanently, death acquires new emotional dimensions. Ancestors are no longer distant memories associated with migration routes or temporary camps. They remain physically beneath the home itself, embedded within daily existence. The living sleep above generations of dead relatives. This proximity changes how time feels. Childhood unfolds surrounded not only by living family members, but by visible reminders of lineage and mortality. The house becomes more than architecture. It becomes continuity made physical. The plastered skulls also reveal extraordinary technical skill for such an early society. Creating them requires careful manipulation of human remains, knowledge of plaster preparation, and close observation of facial structure. Some features are modelled with surprising delicacy. The builders of Jericho are not merely surviving beside a spring. They are already engaging in symbolic practices requiring patience, craftsmanship, and abstract thought. Civilization's roots may lie as much in ritual as in agriculture. The skulls are not the only evidence of changing spiritual life. Across the wider Near East during this era, archaeologists uncover increasing signs of communal ceremony and symbolic behavior. Monumental ritual sites appear at places such as Göbekli Tepe, where massive carved pillars are erected by prehistoric communities before fully developed farming dominates the region. Jericho exists within this broader transformation, though each site develops differently. Human beings are beginning to organize themselves around shared meanings as well as shared survival. Inside Jericho, rituals surrounding death likely help stabilize social life within increasingly dense communities. Permanent settlement creates tensions older nomadic systems rarely faced. Property disputes, inheritance questions, family continuity, and social identity all become more important once people stop moving constantly. Ancestor practices may help anchor communities psychologically during this enormous transition. The skulls may also preserve status distinctions. Some individuals receive elaborate treatment while others do not. This raises difficult questions about emerging inequality. Are these honored ancestors chosen because of the wisdom, leadership, kinship importance, or spiritual significance? Scholars still debate the issue because the archaeological sample remains limited. What seems clear is that Jericho's inhabitants do not view death as simple disappearance. The dead continue participating in household life symbolically. Faces are reconstructed, remains are curated and preserved. Memory becomes material. There is something deeply human about this impulse. Even now, across vastly different cultures, people preserve photographs, heirlooms, graves, and objects tied to lost relatives. Jericho's skulls may represent one of the earliest surviving expressions of that same refusal to let identity vanish completely after death. At night, the houses of the settlement must have felt filled with unseen presence. Beneath packed floors lie buried generations. Firelight flickers against plastered walls while families eat, work, and sleep above ancestors whose faces may still exist nearby in carefully preserved form. The boundary between living and dead feels thinner here than in many later societies, and this emotional world develops alongside growing urban life. The same community constructing walls and organizing food storage is also reshaping human spirituality. Jericho reveals that civilization is never only economic or technological. It changes how people imagine themselves in relation to time, family, and mortality. The settlement's increasing permanence intensifies all these questions. Mobile groups can reinvent themselves through movement. Permanent communities accumulate history relentlessly. Every death adds another layer beneath the houses. Every birth continues the line tied to this specific place beside the spring. Memory becomes territorial. The archaeological record also hints at tension beneath the surface of this continuity. Some burials show signs of complex treatment while others remain simpler. Population density continues increasing. Labour demands remain severe. Agriculture gradually reshapes diets and social organisation. The emotional stability promised by settled life may coexist with new forms of stress and inequality. No single explanation fully accounts for why symbolic practices become so elaborate during this period. Environmental uncertainty, social cohesion, ancestral reverence, and emerging hierarchy may all contribute simultaneously. Human societies rarely change for only one reason. Still, the skulls remain among Jericho's most haunting clues because they preserve something rarely visible in prehistoric archaeology: personality. Not individual names or biographies, but evidence that these people cared intensely about particular human faces. Someone shaped plaster around bone carefully enough to preserve recognizable features. Someone inserted shells to imitate eyes. Someone held the skull of a dead relative or ancestor and chose not to let that face disappear entirely into the earth. Thousands of years later, the result still feels intimate. The reconstructed faces survive while languages, stories, and entire civilizations vanish around them. They emerge from beneath collapsed houses as reminders that the people of Jericho were not merely participants in some abstract Neolithic revolution. They loved, mourned, remembered, feared death, and searched for continuity in a rapidly changing world. And beneath the ancient settlement, their silent faces continue waiting in the dark. Jericho begins as an oasis settlement, but it does not remain isolated for long. As generations pass, pathways leading through the Jordan Valley become more travelled. Small groups arrive carrying unfamiliar materials. Hunters exchange information about distant landscapes. Stone tools found at the settlement begin revealing something remarkable. Objects are appearing here that could not possibly have originated nearby. Obsidian is among the clearest examples. The dark volcanic glass does not occur naturally in the immediate region around Jericho. Yet archaeologists recover obsidian blades and fragments whose geological origins trace back hundreds of kilometers away, likely to Anatolia in what is now modern Turkey. The distances involved are extraordinary for such an early period, long before formal roads, caravans, or empires exist. Networks of exchange are already stretching across the ancient Near East. Jericho is becoming connected to a wider world. The trade probably unfolds gradually through chains of human contact rather than organized expeditions. One community exchanges materials with another, which exchanges with another still farther away. Objects move across generations through overlapping networks of trust, kinship, ritual obligation, and necessity. A blade crafted near distant volcanic mountains eventually arrives beside the spring at Jericho. The object itself matters less than what it represents. Trade requires stability. It requires repeated contact and at least minimal social predictability. Mobile hunter-gatherer societies certainly exchange goods and information, but permanent settlements intensify these systems dramatically. Once communities remain rooted to specific locations, they become identifiable centers within broader regional networks. Jericho's oasis gives it strategic importance. Water sources naturally attract travelers moving through difficult terrain. The settlement may serve as a stopping point where information, tools, food, and marriage connections circulate. Some scholars believe salt from the nearby Dead Sea could also have contributed to regional exchange systems. Salt preserves food and holds enormous practical value in pre-modern societies. The evidence remains incomplete, but Jericho's location places it advantageously within emerging trade corridors. As exchange expands, so does knowledge. People living at Jericho begin encountering objects, techniques, and perhaps beliefs originating far beyond the valley. New stoneworking methods spread, agricultural practices evolve, domesticated plant varieties improve gradually through centuries of cultivation and selection. Human societies across the region are learning from one another continuously, even without writing. Civilization spreads long before formal civilization exists. Inside the settlement, daily life grows increasingly specialized. Not everyone performs identical labor anymore. Some individuals likely become more skilled at tool production. Others focus heavily on food preparation, construction, hunting, or ritual activities. Permanent settlement encourages division of labor because tasks accumulate continuously rather than seasonally. Grinding grain alone consumes enormous time and energy. Agriculture continues developing alongside older hunting traditions. The archaeological record at Jericho reveals changing patterns in animal remains over time. Gazelle hunting remained significant for centuries, but domesticated species begin appearing more regularly in later phases. Goats and sheep gradually become integrated into human economies across the wider Near East during this long transition. The shift changes landscapes permanently. Fields expand around the oasis. Vegetation patterns alter through repeated cultivation and grazing. Human beings are no longer simply adapting to ecosystems. They are reshaping them systematically, though likely without fully realizing the long-term consequences. Population growth intensifies these transformations. Reliable food supplies support larger communities, and larger communities require even more food production. This cycle drives further agricultural dependence. Jericho's inhabitants become increasingly tied to harvest rhythms, storage systems, and seasonal labor demands. And with surplus comes power. The evidence for social hierarchy at Jericho remains debated because prehistoric societies rarely preserve political structures clearly. There are no written records identifying rulers or laws. Yet surplus food always creates new possibilities for influence. Individuals or families controlling storage, water access, ritual authority, or labor coordination may gradually acquire greater status within the community. What survives in the archaeological record hints at emerging differences between households, though not yet the extreme inequality visible in later urban civilizations. Some homes appear larger or more substantial than others during certain phases. Certain burials receive more elaborate treatment. Ritual objects vary in complexity. Scholars still debate whether these patterns reflect true hierarchy, temporary prestige, kinship structures, or simple variation over time. The evidence remains incomplete, but Jericho clearly demonstrates growing social complexity. Trade networks may intensify this process further. Exotic goods carry symbolic value beyond practical usefulness. Obsidian blades are sharper than many local stone tools, but they are also rare and visually striking. Possessing distant materials may signal status, alliances, or participation in broader social systems. Human beings have always attached meaning to rarity. Meanwhile, the settlement itself continues evolving architecturally. Rectangular buildings become increasingly common in many phases. Storage facilities improve. Construction techniques grow more standardized. Shared walls between structures allow denser occupation. Jericho is slowly acquiring characteristics recognizable in much later urban environments, though still on a smaller scale. The sounds of the settlement change as well. Stone grinding echoes through narrow spaces from dawn onward. Animals bleat from enclosures. Children move between houses carrying water or fuel. Flint nappers strike stone rhythmically, producing sharp flakes that scatter across work areas. Fires crackle constantly beneath cooking vessels. Voices overlap in crowded spaces where privacy remains rare. This density produces both opportunity and stress. Larger populations allow collective labour on unprecedented scales. The walls and tower built earlier demonstrate what coordinated effort can achieve, but dense settlements also amplify conflict, disease, and dependency. Jericho's people are increasingly locked into systems requiring continuous cooperation. One failed harvest or prolonged drought could threaten hundreds simultaneously. Scholars studying early agricultural societies often note a paradox at the heart of civilization's beginnings. Farming and settlement allow population growth and technological development, yet individual lives may initially become harder in many ways. Diets narrow, labor intensifies, disease spreads more easily, hierarchies emerge. Jericho embodies this contradiction perfectly. The oasis supports one of humanity's oldest permanent communities, but permanence itself carries hidden costs. The settlement's success depends on constant labor and environmental management. Irrigation or water distribution systems, even in simple forms, require maintenance. Storage facilities must remain protected. Walls need repair. Fields demand attention year after year. There is no easy escape anymore. And yet people continue building here across generations because settled life also offers profound advantages. Families remain connected, knowledge accumulates locally, trade expands possibilities, ritual traditions deepen. Children inherit stable social worlds unimaginable to constantly mobile groups. The settlement acquires momentum. Each generation born at Jericho becomes more invested in its survival. Ancestors lie buried beneath the houses. Labor shaped the walls. Memory fills the streets and courtyards. Leaving the oasis would mean abandoning not only structures, but identity itself. At the edges of the settlement, travellers continue arriving from distant regions carrying tools, stories, seeds, techniques, and news from landscapes far beyond the valley. Jericho is no longer merely a local survival site beside a spring. It is becoming part of a growing human network stretching across the ancient Near East. The world is getting smaller, and in the centre of that transformation stands one crowded oasis settlement, where humanity is slowly learning how trade, agriculture, permanence, and power can bind entire communities together long before the first written histories begin. The wall surrounding Jericho may be one of the earliest signs that human beings are beginning to fear one another in new ways. For centuries, perhaps longer, the settlement beside the spring survives through cooperation, adaptation, and relentless labor. Yet permanent communities create tensions unknown to highly mobile societies. Once food is stored in large quantities, once fields require protection, once water access becomes essential to survival, the landscape changes psychologically. Land is no longer simply travelled through, it becomes defended. The massive stone wall and tower rising around early Jericho stand at the centre of this transformation. Even now, archaeologists disagree about their exact purpose. Some argue the structures primarily defend against floods cascading through the valley during heavy seasonal rains. Others emphasize protection from raids or violent conflict. The truth may involve both environmental and human threats simultaneously. In the prehistoric world, danger rarely arrives from only one direction. The Jordan Valley can become deadly very quickly. Although modern visitors often imagine the region as permanently dry, ancient climatic conditions fluctuate dramatically over thousands of years. Heavy rains occasionally rush down from surrounding highlands in violent flash floods, capable of tearing through settlements built from mud brick. Water, the force that sustains Jericho, can also destroy it. But environmental instability is only part of the story. As more communities across the Near East experiment with settlement and cultivation, competition likely intensifies. Reliable springs are limited, productive land is finite. Herds migrate unpredictably during difficult seasons. A permanent settlement storing grain beside a dependable water source becomes both attractive and vulnerable. Scholars still debate how organized prehistoric violence truly becomes during this era. Archaeology preserves warfare unevenly. Skeletons with traumatic injuries, burned settlements, defensive structures, and weapon concentrations all provide clues. Yet interpretation remains difficult. Some researchers caution against imagining constant conflict simply because walls exist. Others argue that once sedentary life develops, territorial competition becomes almost unavoidable. Jericho stands directly inside that uncertainty. The settlement's defences reveal at minimum a growing awareness of collective vulnerability. Human beings here are investing enormous labour into protection because the risks of remaining exposed have become too great. Mobility once provided security through escape. Permanent settlement demands fortification instead. This shift changes social organisation profoundly. A wall requires maintenance. Gates must be monitored, labour must be coordinated, collective defence encourages stronger group identity. The people inside the enclosure increasingly see themselves as part of a single community, separated from outsiders beyond the walls. Civilization may begin partly through the creation of boundaries. Inside Jericho, population density continues rising during prosperous phases. Fields surrounding the oasis support larger numbers. Storage systems expand. Trade networks bring unfamiliar goods and perhaps unfamiliar people into contact with the settlement. Success attracts attention, and success creates anxiety. There are signs across the broader region that climate instability continues placing pressure on prehistoric communities. Drought cycles likely reduce available resources in some areas. Hunting patterns shift as environments change. Scholars studying the transition into agriculture often emphasize that farming does not emerge during perfect abundance. It develops partly because environmental unpredictability forces experimentation and adaptation. The evidence remains incomplete, but Jericho's inhabitants almost certainly experience years of severe strain. A poor harvest in a permanent settlement carries terrifying consequences. Mobile groups facing scarcity can sometimes disperse temporarily or relocate entirely. Jericho's population is increasingly anchored physically and emotionally to the oasis. Stored grain can buffer hardship for a time, but only if reserves remain sufficient and protected. The wall therefore becomes more than architecture. It is insurance against uncertainty. At night, guards or watchful residents may stand atop portions of the fortification, looking outward into darkness beyond the settlement. The valley stretches silent beneath the stars. Somewhere beyond sight are other communities competing for survival under the same unstable skies. Whether actual raids occur frequently or only occasionally, the fear of vulnerability itself shapes behavior. Human beings are learning that civilization requires defense. There is another possibility as well, one more subtle but equally important. The wall may partly defend the settlement from internal collapse, rather than purely external threats. Organized communal labor creates social cohesion. Shared construction projects bind populations together psychologically. Building the wall may reinforce collective identity during periods of rapid social change. The people of Jericho are no longer wandering bands connected loosely through kinship and seasonal movement. They're becoming something closer to a permanent society. That transformation is stressful. Agriculture intensifies workloads. Population density increases disease transmission. Property and inheritance become more meaningful. Ancestors buried beneath homes tie families emotionally to place. Disputes become harder to escape. Every pressure associated with settled life concentrates inside the settlement walls. And still the people remain. What survives in the archaeological record suggests extraordinary resilience. Jericho endures climatic fluctuations, shifting economic systems, and long periods of adaptation that would likely have shattered less stable communities. The oasis continues attracting human occupation because water remains stronger than uncertainty. Yet cracks begin appearing beneath the surface. Certain occupational phases at Jericho show interruptions and rebuilding episodes difficult to interpret cleanly. Some structures collapse or are abandoned. Population levels fluctuate. Construction styles change. No single explanation fully accounts for these shifts because prehistoric evidence rarely tells a straightforward story. Environmental stress, social conflict, economic change, disease, or migration may all contribute simultaneously. The wall itself eventually falls into ruin. Mud brick structures erode constantly without maintenance. Stone can collapse after generations of neglect or seismic activity. Jericho sits within a geologically active region where earthquakes remain possible. Scholars have proposed seismic destruction for some phases of the site, though evidence varies and interpretations remain debated. What matters most is that permanence never guarantees stability. The settlement's defences symbolize humanity's growing attempt to control uncertainty, yet no wall can fully protect against drought, environmental change, internal tension, or time itself. Jericho's inhabitants are discovering one of civilization's oldest truths: the more complex a society becomes, the more fragile it may also become. Still, there are moments when the settlement must have felt almost invincible. The spring continues flowing. Grain stores fill after successful harvests. Trade goods arrive from distant regions. Children grow into adulthood within walls their grandparents helped construct. The tower rises above the oasis as proof that collective labour can reshape the landscape itself. To the people living there, Jericho may have seemed permanent, but beneath the rhythms of ordinary life, pressures are accumulating slowly. Climate continues shifting across the Near East. Agricultural dependence deepens. Social organisation grows more complicated. The settlement's survival depends increasingly on systems requiring constant cooperation and environmental stability, and human history has rarely allowed either for very long. The walls of Jericho remain among the earliest great monuments humanity ever builds, yet they also foreshadow something darker. From this point onward, civilization and insecurity will grow together. Cities will rise behind walls across the world for thousands of years, each one promising safety while revealing how vulnerable settled life truly is. Jericho stands at the beginning of that long story. Then, slowly, the settlement begins to thin. The change does not happen in a single dramatic catastrophe. There is no final night when flames consume the city, while terrified inhabitants flee into darkness. Jericho's earliest decline unfolds more quietly, almost invisibly at first, buried within subtle shifts in architecture, population density, and occupation layers that archaeologists must reconstruct thousands of years later from fragments of earth. One house is abandoned and not immediately rebuilt. A storage area empties. A section of wall falls into disrepair. The rhythms of permanent life begin weakening. For modern observers, this gradual unravelling can feel surprising. Early Jericho often appears in popular imagination as the triumphant dawn of civilization, the place where humanity finally learns to settle, build, and organize collectively. Yet the archaeological record tells a far more unstable story. The first great experiments in urban life are fragile from the beginning. Civilization does not rise smoothly upward. It staggers. What survives in the evidence suggests that Jericho experiences multiple interruptions and transformations over its long history. Some occupational phases are dense and prosperous, others shrink dramatically. Entire architectural traditions disappear and later reappear in altered forms. Population estimates fluctuate sharply depending on the period. Scholars still debate the causes because no single explanation fully accounts for the pattern. Environmental stress almost certainly plays a role. The Near East during the Neolithic period remains climatically unstable in many phases. Rainfall patterns shift unpredictably across generations. Droughts may reduce agricultural productivity for years at a time. Even with its reliable spring, Jericho depends on surrounding ecological systems that can become increasingly fragile under population pressure. Agriculture itself creates hidden vulnerabilities. At first, farming appears to offer security through predictable food production and storage, but dependence on a limited number of crops can become dangerous. A failed harvest now threatens dense populations tied permanently to one location. Soil exhaustion may gradually reduce productivity if land is overused continuously. Deforestation for fuel and construction can alter local environments over time. The people of Jericho are building permanence atop systems that require constant environmental balance. There are also signs that broader regional patterns may be shifting. Other settlements across the Levant rise and fall during these centuries as human communities continue experimenting with different forms of agriculture, mobility, and social organization. Some groups remain more mobile. Others develop increasingly permanent villages. Trade networks evolve. Technologies spread unevenly. Jericho is no longer unique in attempting to settle life. That may matter more than it first appears. When permanent settlement is rare, a place like Jericho functions as a major regional center. But as neighboring communities become more stable and self-sufficient, populations and influence may disperse outward. New settlements emerge near other water sources and productive lands. The oasis remains important, but perhaps less singular than before. The evidence remains incomplete, yet demographic shifts may partly explain certain phases of contraction. There is another possibility buried within the archaeology social strain. Dense permanent settlements generate tensions older human systems rarely faced for extended periods. Disputes over property, food distribution, labor obligations, and social status become increasingly difficult to manage as populations grow. Without formal states or written laws, communities rely heavily on kinship structures, shared traditions, and collective cooperation. But cooperation can fracture. Some archaeologists studying early farming societies suggest that sedentary life initially creates harsher physical conditions for many individuals despite supporting larger populations overall. Skeletal remains from various Neolithic sites show evidence of nutritional stress, repetitive labor injuries, and disease associated with crowding. Jericho's inhabitants may have discovered that civilization carries exhausting costs alongside its advantages. The settlement's architecture reflects instability during certain periods. Building styles shift noticeably over time. Circular houses characteristic of earlier phases gradually give way to rectangular structures in many later occupations, then sometimes disappear again depending on the layer examined. Some sections of the settlement appear less densely occupied. Monumental features that once required intense communal labor no longer receive the same maintenance. The Great Wall itself may deteriorate gradually through neglect. Mud brick erodes relentlessly without continuous repair. Stone structures weaken after generations of environmental exposure or seismic disturbance. Jericho lies near a tectonically active region where earthquakes remain common even today. Some researchers propose that seismic events contribute to destruction phases at the site, though definitive proof remains difficult to establish. In prehistoric archaeology, silence is often the loudest evidence. When rebuilding stops, archaeologists notice. When once busy areas remain empty, the absence becomes meaningful. And at Jericho, there are moments when the settlement seems a retreat inward from its earlier ambitions. Yet even during decline, people rarely vanish completely from the oasis. This continuity is part of what makes Jericho so remarkable. Many ancient settlements disappear permanently after collapse. Jericho instead experiences cycles of contraction and return. The spring continues flowing, drawing human occupation back repeatedly even after difficult periods. Water remains stronger than collapse. Still, the emotional reality for the inhabitants themselves must have been frightening during times of instability. A settlement built over generations carries enormous accumulated memory. Ancestors lie buried beneath homes. Walls embody communal labour stretching back centuries. Every abandoned structure signals more than economic decline. It signals rupture in continuity itself. For the first time, the people of Jericho may begin confronting a disturbing possibility. Permanence can fail. That realization becomes one of civilization's oldest recurring fears. Later cities across history will experience the same anxiety repeatedly. Drought, war, plague, trade collapse, political conflict, environmental exhaustion. Every urban society eventually learns that no structure lasts forever. Jericho encounters this lesson astonishingly early. There are hints that some residents leave voluntarily during difficult periods, perhaps dispersing towards smaller settlements or more favourable lands elsewhere. Others likely remain beside the spring, adapting to reduced populations and changing conditions. Human societies rarely collapse uniformly. Decline is uneven. Some families survive better than others. Some traditions continue while others vanish. The archaeological layers preserve these interruptions imperfectly, like damaged memory. One generation repairs homes while another abandons them. One phase expands outward while the next contracts. The settlement breathes in cycles rather than following a straight path toward complexity. This pattern forces historians to reconsider older ideas about inevitable human progress. Jericho reveals that early civilization is experimental, unstable, and reversible. Agriculture does not guarantee endless growth. Monumental architecture does not guarantee political continuity. Even one of humanity's oldest urban communities struggles constantly against fragmentation. And yet the oasis never fully dies. Palm trees still rise near the spring. Water still cuts through the valley floor. Travellers still arrive seeking shelter and resources in a harsh landscape. The settlement may shrink, but it continues existing in some form because geography keeps inviting return. The first city nobody talks about is already learning how civilizations survive not through uninterrupted success, but through repeated recovery after failure. The mound grows taller with every collapse. By now, the settlement at Jericho has already lived through centuries of rebuilding, abandonment, repair, and return. Entire generations rise beside the spring, believing their homes permanent, only for later inhabitants to tear down crumbling walls and build directly over them. Mud brick dissolves back into earth. Roof beams rot. Floodwater cuts through neglected structures. Fire blackens storage rooms. Then new foundations appear above the ruins, and life begins again. This process continues for thousands of years. The result is the enormous layered mound archaeologists eventually excavate at Tel es Sultan. Each layer represents a different version of Jericho, separated from the others by destruction, adaptation, or slow transformation. Unlike later cities built according to centralized plans, the settlement evolves organically through survival itself. History here accumulates vertically, and every layer preserves evidence of humanity learning from previous failure. Some occupational phases are sparse and fragile. Others reveal expanding architecture, increased trade, and renewed communal labor. Pottery eventually becomes widespread after being absent in earlier periods. Tool technologies improve gradually. Agricultural systems intensify. Domesticated animals become increasingly important to the economy. Yet for all these changes, the central truth remains constant: people keep returning to the oasis. There is something almost gravitational about the spring. Even after periods of decline, the water source continues attracting human communities because the broader landscape remains difficult and unpredictable. Jericho's persistence is not the story of uninterrupted success. It is the story of repeated reoccupation by people who understand that survival in the valley still depends on access to dependable fresh water. The settlement changes character over time as new cultures and technologies spread through the Near East. Early Neolithic Jericho looks very different from later Bronze Age Jericho. The earliest inhabitants live in relatively small mud brick structures and organize society without writing or formal states. Thousands of years later, new populations inherit the same landscape, but belong to worlds increasingly shaped by regional trade networks, metallurgy, emerging kingdoms, and expanding political systems. Still, beneath every phase lie the older ruins. A Bronze Age resident walking across the city unknowingly steps above homes built thousands of years earlier by people who lived before pottery, before bronze tools, before recorded history itself. The continuity becomes almost difficult to comprehend. Few places on Earth preserve such deep layers of uninterrupted human return. Archaeologists excavating Jericho often describe the strange experience of moving downward through time physically. Roman remains sit above Hellenistic layers. Those lie above Iron Age occupation. Beneath them are Bronze Age structures. Deeper still appear Neolithic settlements older than almost any named civilization remembered in written history. The mound becomes a compressed record of humanity itself. But continuity should not be mistaken for stability. Jericho repeatedly suffers periods of destruction and uncertainty. Fire layers appear in some phases, walls collapse, settlement patterns shift dramatically. Some occupations shrink to only partial use of the mound while nearby regions gain importance. Scholars still debate many specific causes because archaeological evidence rarely provides complete explanations. Earthquakes remain one possible factor. The Jordan Valley lies along the Dead Sea Transform Fault System, one of the major tectonic boundaries in the region. Seismic activity has shaped local geography for immense spans of time. Ancient earthquakes could easily damage mud brick architecture and destabilize densely packed settlements. Some researchers suggest seismic destruction contributed to certain occupational breaks at Jericho, though separating earthquake evidence from ordinary structural collapse remains difficult. Climate continues shaping the settlement as well. Long-term environmental fluctuations alter agricultural productivity across the Near East repeatedly over millennia. Periods of drought weaken populations. Trade routes shift according to political and ecological conditions. Forests decline in some areas through human use and changing rainfall patterns. The people rebuilding Jericho constantly adapt to environmental systems larger than themselves. and each rebuilding carries memory forward imperfectly. Knowledge survives unevenly after collapse. Construction techniques change. Ritual practices evolve or disappear. Burial customs shift. Languages transform. One generation inherits fragments of older traditions without fully understanding their original meaning. By later periods, even the people living at Jericho may no longer remember the true age of the settlement beneath their feet. Civilization forgets itself surprisingly easily. This forgetting becomes one of the most haunting aspects of Jericho's long history. Modern observers often imagine ancient cities as places deeply connected to their own pasts, but historical continuity rarely works so neatly. Communities rebuild because the location remains useful, not necessarily because they preserve accurate memory of every earlier phase. The tower and earliest wall eventually vanish beneath layers of later occupation. Their builders become anonymous long before archaeology rediscovers them. Meanwhile, the settlement enters new historical worlds. Bronze tools spread across the region. Trade intensifies between larger political centers. Fortified cities appear elsewhere in the Near East. Writing systems emerge in Mesopotamia and Egypt, while Jericho continues existing within broader networks increasingly shaped by literate civilizations. The oasis survives these transformations partly by adaptation. Some phases emphasize agriculture more heavily. Others benefit from trade routes connecting larger regional powers. Palm groves continue supplying valuable resources. The Jordan Valley remains strategically important as movement through the region intensifies over time. Yet Jericho is never fully secure. Its long history is marked by vulnerability as much as endurance. Powerful states rise around it. Armies move through nearby territories. Climatic instability returns periodically. Population centers shift elsewhere. The settlement persists, but often precariously. What survives in the archaeological record suggests remarkable human resilience rather than uninterrupted prosperity. There are moments when the mound must have seemed almost abandoned compared to earlier centuries. Winds move through ruined walls. Sections of older structures collapse inward. Vegetation grows across neglected spaces. Then slowly people return again, clearing debris, repairing foundations, rebuilding homes atop forgotten ruins. The cycle repeats so often that collapse itself becomes part of Jericho's identity. This pattern challenges modern assumptions about cities. Today, urban centers are often imagined as engines of permanent growth. Jericho reveals a much older reality. Ancient settlements survive through flexibility, contraction, and recovery rather than constant expansion. The oasis teaches endurance through repetition. Every generation inherits a damaged world and attempts to stabilize it temporarily. Some succeed better than others. Some phases flourish. Others barely survive. But human beings continue choosing this place because the spring remains, because memory lingers in the land even after formal history disappears. At dusk, the mound would have looked strange during periods of rebuilding. Half-collapsed walls stand beside newly repaired homes. Ancient debris lies scattered beneath fresh construction. Children play above buried cities they cannot imagine. Smoke rises from hearths while old ruins sink gradually deeper beneath the earth. Jericho never truly becomes one city. It becomes many cities layered atop one another across 10,000 years of human struggle, adaptation, collapse, and return. As the great civilizations of the ancient world begin rising around the Near East, Jericho slowly slips toward the edges of memory. To the west, the kingdoms of ancient Egypt build monuments vast enough to survive for millennia. Along the rivers of Mesopotamia, cities develop writing systems, bureaucracies, legal codes, and armies. Empires expand outward, carrying royal inscriptions and organized religion across enormous territories. Names like Old Kingdom of Egypt, Akkadian Empire, and later Neo-Assyrian Empire dominate surviving historical records. Jericho remains inhabited through much of this transformation, but it no longer stands alone at the frontier of civilization. This is one reason the settlement eventually becomes overshadowed despite its astonishing age. The earliest phases of Jericho belong to a world before written history, before centralized states, before monumental empires capable of preserving their own narratives permanently. Later civilizations leave behind texts celebrating rulers, battles, trade expeditions, and divine authority. Jericho's oldest inhabitants leave only stone, mud brick, bones, and silence. History tends to remember those who write. The oasis continues functioning as a regional settlement through changing political eras, yet its role shifts repeatedly depending on wider forces shaping the Near East. Trade routes move, kingdoms expand and collapse, armies cross the Jordan Valley. Jericho survives partly because geography continues favoring occupation, but survival does not guarantee prominence. In some periods, the settlement flourishes modestly under larger political systems. In others, it declines relative to rising urban centres elsewhere. By the Bronze Age, cities across the Near East have become far more elaborate than the prehistoric Jericho of plastered skulls and stone towers. Palaces dominate urban skylines, temples accumulate wealth and authority, bronze weapons transform warfare. Long-distance trade networks stretch across continents carrying tin, copper, textiles, incense, and luxury goods. Jericho exists inside this increasingly interconnected world, but it no longer defines it. And yet beneath every newer structure remain the buried foundations of something far older. This buried depth becomes almost invisible to later inhabitants. A Bronze Age merchant walking through Jericho likely recognizes the settlement as ancient in a local sense, but not as one of humanity's oldest continuously occupied places. The deepest layers have vanished beneath centuries of rebuilding. Memory compresses, myth replaces knowledge. Civilizations routinely forget how old they truly are. The settlement's strategic location still matters. Jericho sits near important movement corridors connecting the Jordan Valley to surrounding regions. Control of water and fertile land remains valuable in an often harsh environment. Palm groves and agricultural production continue supporting occupation. Yet the oasis increasingly lives in the shadow of larger powers. Egyptian influence reaches into the Levant during several historical periods. Trade and political authority flow through the region unevenly. Later, empires based farther north and east compete for dominance over territories surrounding the Jordan Valley. Jericho becomes one small node within much larger struggles. What survives in the archaeological record suggests alternating periods of prosperity and vulnerability. Fortifications appear in some later phases. Certain occupational layers show signs of destruction or abrupt change. Scholars continue debating specific causes because ancient cities rarely leave behind simple stories. Warfare, economic decline, environmental stress, political transition, and internal instability often overlap. There are moments when Jericho almost disappears historically altogether. Compared to imperial capitals covered in inscriptions and monumental stone architecture, the oasis seems modest. Ancient chroniclers focus attention elsewhere. Larger cities command armies and shape regional politics, while Jericho persists quietly through cycles of occupation and decline. Yet this quiet survival conceals something extraordinary. Most ancient cities eventually vanish completely. Some are abandoned after environmental collapse. Others are destroyed permanently by war or changing trade routes. Many become empty ruins swallowed by desert or vegetation. Jericho instead continues attracting human settlement across astonishing spans of time. The spring keeps calling people back. Even as empires rise and fall around it, the oasis remains fundamentally tied to survival in the valley. Farmers cultivate nearby land, travelers stop for water. Local populations rebuild structures atop older ruins without fully grasping the depth beneath them. There is also another reason Jericho fades from broader historical attention. Its greatest achievements belong to prehistory. The famous tower and earliest wall are already unimaginably ancient by the time literate civilizations dominate the Near East. Later societies living nearby may preserve vague traditions about ancient ruins or sacred places, but the true age of the settlement becomes difficult to comprehend without archaeology. Human memory has limits. A dynasty lasting 500 years feels ancient to those living within it. Jericho's deepest layers stretch backward across 10,000 years. No oral tradition alone could preserve such depth accurately. Entire languages disappear. Religions transform. Empires rewrite regional histories according to their own priorities. The oldest city nobody talks about becomes buried not only physically but historically. And yet traces survive indirectly. Later traditions associated with Jericho begin emerging through religious narratives and regional memory. The oasis acquires symbolic importance within evolving cultural and spiritual landscapes of the ancient Near East. Some of these stories will eventually become enormously influential, though often disconnected from the settlement's deepest prehistoric past. Meanwhile, the mound continues growing layer by layer. Roman occupation eventually reaches the region. Roads improve. Political authority shifts repeatedly between expanding powers. New architectural forms appear atop older ruins. Date cultivation remains important. The climate continues fluctuating subtly over centuries. Earthquakes still threaten structures periodically. And beneath everything lie the forgotten remains of the first experiments in urban life. Archaeologists much later will struggle to separate these layers carefully because Jericho contains so many overlapping histories compressed into one mound. Every civilization leaves traces while simultaneously damaging or burying what came before. Excavation becomes an act of peeling back entire worlds stacked atop one another. But during most of history, no one fully realizes what the mound contains. Travelers see an old settlement in a harsh valley. They do not see one of humanity's earliest known large-scale communities hidden beneath their feet. The origins of civilization remain buried so deeply that even civilizations themselves lose awareness of them. This may be the strangest aspect of Jericho's story. Humanity's oldest urban memories survive only accidentally. The place where settled life first intensified enough to reshape human history becomes overshadowed by later empires better at recording themselves. Stone towers older than the pyramids disappear beneath ordinary earth while younger kingdoms dominate collective imagination. Still, the oasis endures. Palm trees continue moving in the valley wind. Water still rises from the spring. Generations keep arriving, building, leaving, and returning again. The world changes around Jericho repeatedly, yet the settlement survives quietly beneath the expanding weight of history, waiting for someone to remember how old it truly is. For thousands of years, the mound at Jericho sits in silence while entire civilizations rise and disappear around it. Wind moves across broken stone. Farmers work nearby fields without knowing what lies beneath them. Travelers pass through the Jordan Valley carrying goods, stories, armies, and religions from one age into another. The deepest layers of the settlement remain sealed below the earth, hidden beneath accumulated debris from nearly every phase of human history in the region. Then archaeologists arrive. At first, early excavations across the Near East are often driven less by science than by curiosity, imperial ambition, or the search for places mentioned in religious texts. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, many researchers approach ancient sites hoping to connect archaeology with familiar historical narratives. Jericho attracts attention partly for these reasons, yet once serious excavation begins, the mound reveals something far older and stranger than most investigators expect. The deeper they dig, the more history begins dissolving. Later ruins appear first, relatively familiar to archaeologists trained in classical and biblical periods. Pottery fragments help identify chronological layers. Walls emerge from compacted earth. Burials appear. But then the excavations continue downward into periods predating writing itself. Civilization keeps receding farther into the past. One of the most important figures associated with Jericho's excavation is Kathleen Kenyon, whose work during the 1950s transforms understanding of the site dramatically. Using improved stratigraphic techniques, Kenyon and her team excavate carefully through the mound's layered occupational history. Instead of treating Jericho simply as a location tied to later historical traditions, they begin reconstructing its enormous prehistoric depth. What they uncover shocks the archaeological world. The stone tower and massive wall emerge from levels thousands of years older than expected. Beneath Bronze Age and Iron Age remains lie Neolithic settlements of astonishing antiquity. Circular mud brick homes appear from periods before pottery becomes widespread. Human burials and plastered skulls reveal ritual complexity far older than traditional models of civilization once allowed. Jericho forces historians to rethink the timeline of urban life itself. Before these discoveries, many scholars assumed monumental architecture required fully developed states, organized religions, and advanced agricultural systems. Yet the evidence at Jericho suggests large-scale communal construction appears astonishingly early, during a transitional world where humanity is only beginning to experiment with permanent settlement. The implications are enormous. Civilization may not emerge through a neat sequence of stages after all. Ritual, social cooperation, architecture, and agriculture appear intertwined in complicated ways from the beginning. Jericho reveals that prehistoric humans are capable of organizational complexity far beyond older stereotypes. And perhaps most unsettling of all, they achieve this without writing. No records explain how labor is organized. No kings claim credit for construction. No laws survive describing social systems. Archaeologists must reconstruct entire worlds from physical traces alone. Every discovery raises new questions alongside answers. The tower becomes especially controversial. How could people without metal tools construct something so large so early? What motivates communal labor on that scale was the structure defensive, ceremonial, astronomical, or symbolic? Scholars still debate these issues intensely because the evidence remains incomplete. Jericho repeatedly resists simple interpretation. Even dating the site proves challenging. Radiocarbon techniques improve gradually during the 20th century, refining estimates for Jericho's earliest occupation phases. The dates keep pushing deeper into prehistory. Some layers appear connected to the pre-pottery Neolithic A period, reaching back roughly 11,000 years before the present. This places Jericho among the oldest known large permanent settlements ever discovered. The realization changes archaeology permanently. Suddenly, the origins of cities no longer seem tied exclusively to later literate civilizations. Humanity's urban story begins much earlier, in a world still balanced between hunting, gathering, cultivation, and ritual experimentation. Excavating Jericho also reveals how fragile archaeological knowledge can be. The mound contains immense chronological complexity compressed vertically into one site. Every trench cuts through multiple civilizations stacked atop one another. Earlier excavations sometimes damage context later researchers wish had remained untouched. Interpretations shift repeatedly as dating methods improve and new theories emerge. Archaeology is never simply discovery. It is reconstruction through fragments. At Jericho, the fragments are overwhelming. Tiny seeds preserved in ancient layers help reconstruct prehistoric diets and climate conditions. Animal bones reveal changing hunting and domestication patterns. Microscopic wear on stone tools suggest harvesting practices. Plaster composition offers clues about technological knowledge. Human skeletons preserve evidence of labor stress, nutrition, illness, and injury. Entire vanished lives reappear indirectly through material traces, and yet so much remains unknowable. No excavation can recover the sound of voices inside the settlement. No artifact fully explains emotional experience. Archaeologists can estimate population sizes, identify building techniques, and analyze burial customs, but they cannot reconstruct the precise fears, beliefs, or relationships shaping everyday life at Jericho. The silence surrounding the site persists even as evidence accumulates. There are also fierce academic debates surrounding interpretation. Some scholars caution against calling Jericho the oldest city because definitions of urbanism remain contested. Was it truly a city, or an unusually large village? How much social hierarchy existed? Did communal labour emerge through leadership, ritual cooperation, or environmental necessity? No single explanation fully accounts for the settlement's complexity. Still, even the debates themselves demonstrate Jericho's importance. The site forces historians, archaeologists, and anthropologists to reconsider fundamental assumptions about how civilization begins. Human beings appear capable of dense permanent settlement, monumental construction, and symbolic sophistication far earlier than once believed. The mound becomes a kind of time machine. Layer after layer reveals humanity crossing invisible thresholds from mobility toward permanence, from hunting toward cultivation, from scattered bands toward organized communities, from temporary shelters toward monumental architecture. All of it happens gradually enough that the people living through the transition likely never recognize its historical significance. Modern excavation also exposes the emotional power of deep time. Standing inside the trenches at Jericho, archaeologists confront nearly continuous human occupation, stretching backward across 10 millennia. Few places on Earth preserve such depth physically in one location. The experience alters perspective. Empires once considered unimaginably ancient suddenly appear recent. The pyramids are younger than Jericho's earliest wall. Classical Greece is separated from the first settlement layers by spans of time greater than those separating modern civilization from Rome. Even the earliest written records emerge astonishingly late compared to Jericho's deepest occupation. The oldest city nobody talks about turns out to predate history itself. And beneath the desert light of the Jordan Valley, archaeologists continue uncovering pieces of humanity's forgotten beginning fragments of a world where the first experiments in permanent life slowly transformed what it meant to be human. For much of the modern world, Jericho is known not first through archaeology, but through story. The city appears in religious tradition as a place of walls, conquest, divine intervention, and collapse. For centuries, this narrative shapes how people imagine the settlement. Pilgrims, theologians, historians, and travelers approach Jericho carrying expectations formed long before scientific excavation begins. By the time archaeologists start digging seriously into the mound, this site already exists inside one of humanity's most influential cultural memories, and that memory is complicated. The famous biblical account describes the Israelites arriving at Jericho after crossing the Jordan River. The city's walls fall dramatically after ritual processions and trumpet blasts, allowing conquest of the settlement. The story becomes deeply embedded in religious imagination across Judaism, Christianity, and later global culture. For many centuries, Jericho is understood primarily through this lens. Then archaeology enters the conversation. What excavators uncover beneath the mound does not erase the historical tradition surrounding Jericho, but it does complicate nearly every simple assumption about it. The site contains so many occupation layers spanning such immense periods of time that matching specific stories to precise archaeological events becomes extraordinarily difficult. Scholars still debate these questions intensely. Some researchers argue certain destruction layers may loosely correspond to historical conflicts remembered later through oral tradition. Others conclude the archaeological chronology does not align clearly with the biblical narrative in a straightforward way. Excavation results have been interpreted differently over decades depending on dating methods, assumptions, and evolving evidence. The evidence remains incomplete. This uncertainty often frustrates people searching for definitive answers, yet Jericho demonstrates how ancient history actually works in most cases. Myths, memories, religious traditions, political narratives, and physical archaeology rarely align perfectly. Human societies reshape the past constantly, preserving fragments while altering meaning across generations. And Jericho has accumulated more generations than almost anywhere else on Earth. By the time later traditions emerge, the settlement is already unimaginably old. The people associated with the earliest walls and tower belong to a prehistoric world separated by thousands of years from later biblical periods. Entire civilizations rise and collapse between Jericho's Neolithic origins and the eras described in ancient texts. This immense time depth matters enormously. When modern audiences hear Jericho, many instinctively picture a single ancient city frozen in one historical moment. In reality, Jericho is a sequence of many different settlements layered atop one another across millennia. One phase may flourish while another collapses centuries later. Walls are built, destroyed, rebuilt, abandoned, and replaced repeatedly over time. There is no single Jericho. Archaeologists excavating the site confront this complexity constantly. One trench may expose Bronze Age fortifications. Another reveals Neolithic homes thousands of years older. Pottery styles shift dramatically between layers. Burial customs evolve. Entire cultures occupy the same mound at different periods while sharing little direct continuity beyond geography itself. The famous walls become especially controversial. Some excavators in earlier decades believed they had identified remains corresponding directly to the biblical destruction narrative. Later scholars challenged those conclusions based on revised dating evidence. Kathleen Kenyon's work in particular argued that certain major fortifications were destroyed earlier than traditional chronologies associated with the biblical account. Debate continues even now, but beyond the arguments themselves lies a deeper truth. Jericho's significance extends far beyond any single story attached to it. The site matters not only because of religious tradition, but because it preserves one of humanity's longest experiments in settled life. And in some ways, myth and archaeology intersect more subtly than either side often admits. Ancient stories frequently preserve echoes of real places and events while transforming them through symbolism, theology, and cultural memory. A city repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt over thousands of years naturally accumulates legends. Walls collapse. Armies pass through. Earthquakes strike. Populations scatter and return. Over time, these experiences become narrative. Jericho is exactly the kind of place where history and myth would intertwine. The settlement's location also contributes to its symbolic power. Sitting near the Jordan River in a harsh valley landscape, Jericho functions historically as both gateway and refuge. Palm groves and springs create an oasis environment that must have appeared almost miraculous during difficult seasons. Travelers approaching the city from barren terrain would encounter sudden fertility and water emerging from dust and stone. Places like this naturally acquire spiritual meaning. Even the ancient tower from Jericho's earliest phases carries an almost mythic quality today. Built before written history, it stands at the edge between archaeology and legend. Modern observers struggle emotionally to place it within familiar timelines. The structure feels too old, too sophisticated, too silent. This silence invites speculation. Over the years, fringe theories inevitably gather around Jericho as they do around many ancient sites. Some claim lost advanced civilizations or forgotten technologies explain its construction. Others exaggerate archaeological mysteries into fantasies disconnected from evidence. Yet mainstream archaeology paints a far more fascinating picture without needing unsupported claims. Human beings themselves are extraordinary enough. The builders of Jericho's earliest monuments are not aliens, vanished superhumans, or possessors of secret impossible knowledge. They are prehistoric communities adapting creatively to environmental pressure, social change, and new forms of collective life. Their achievements seem astonishing precisely because modern people often underestimate the intelligence and organizational capacity of ancient humans. Jericho corrects that arrogance brutally. The site demonstrates that people living 10,000 years ago are fully capable of symbolic thought, engineering, ritual behavior, cooperation, and social complexity. They build walls before formal kingship. They preserve ancestral skulls with artistic care. They organize dense settlements long before writing emerges. Civilization's roots run deeper than later empires like to imagine. Meanwhile, religious tradition continues surrounding the oasis in later centuries. Jericho remains inhabited through many historical eras and appears repeatedly in spiritual and historical narratives connected to the wider region. The city's layered identity grows richer and more complicated over time. Modern visitors often arrive carrying multiple Jerichos in their minds simultaneously. There is the biblical Jericho of collapsing walls and sacred history. There is the archaeological Jericho of plastered skulls and Neolithic towers. There is the living modern city nearby, shaped by contemporary political realities and ordinary human life. And beneath all of them lies the prehistoric oasis where settled humanity first began reshaping itself beside a spring in the desert. No single story fully contains the place. Perhaps that is why Jericho still feels mysterious even after decades of excavation and scholarship. The mound preserves too much time, myth, memory, faith, science, and deep prehistory overlap there until clear boundaries become impossible to maintain. The oldest city nobody talks about is also one of the hardest cities to understand completely. Even after more than a century of excavation, Jericho still refuses to become fully understood. Archaeologists have mapped walls, uncovered burials, analyzed seeds, reconstructed diets, traced trade routes, and measured occupation layers stretching back nearly 11,000 years. Entire careers have been devoted to interpreting the mound at Tel es Sultan. Yet some of the most basic questions about the settlement remain unsettled. How large was Jericho at its peak during the earliest phases? How organized was its society? Who directed labor for the wall and tower? Why did people invest so heavily in permanent life so early? The deeper scholars investigate, the more uncertain many answers become. Part of the problem lies in the nature of prehistoric evidence itself. Jericho's earliest inhabitants leave behind no written language, no laws, no personal names, no surviving myths explaining their worldview directly. Archaeologists reconstruct entire societies through fragments, collapsed walls, microscopic plant remains, human bones worn by labor, discarded tools, traces of ancient fires. Every conclusion contains interpretation. Even population estimates vary dramatically depending on the methods used. Some researchers envision Jericho as a surprisingly large proto-urban settlement for its era, perhaps housing several hundred people or more during certain phases. Others argue the site's scale has occasionally been exaggerated and caution against projecting later urban concepts backward onto the Neolithic world. The word city itself becomes controversial. Modern audiences imagine cities as places with governments, markets, social classes, streets, and formal institutions. Jericho exists before many of those systems fully emerge, yet the settlement clearly surpasses ordinary village life in important ways. Its monumental construction projects, population density, and permanence distinguish it sharply from earlier human communities. Jericho occupies a blurred threshold between worlds. That ambiguity is precisely what makes the site so important. Civilization rarely appears suddenly. It develops unevenly through experimentation, adaptation, and partial transformation. Jericho captures humanity during one of those unstable transitional moments when older hunter-gatherer traditions overlap with emerging settled life. The settlement feels unfinished in a historical sense. Its people build walls without kingdoms. They preserve ancestors without organized priesthoods recognizable in later civilizations. They cultivate crops while still relying heavily on hunting. They live densely together without leaving behind written bureaucracies. Everything is becoming something else. There are also lingering mysteries surrounding the tower itself. Scholars continue debating whether its function is primarily defensive, ceremonial, astronomical, symbolic, or some combination impossible to separate neatly. One intriguing theory suggests the structure's staircase and alignment may connect intentionally to seasonal solar movements against nearby mountains during the summer solstice. The evidence remains debated. Yet even disputed theories reveal how sophisticated Jericho's builders may have been in observing landscapes and celestial patterns. Prehistoric humans often possessed deep environmental knowledge developed across countless generations of direct interaction with nature. Modern assumptions about intellectual progress can obscure this reality. The people of Jericho are not primitive minds waiting for civilization to educate them. They're already fully human, confronting entirely new social realities with remarkable creativity. Violence remains another unresolved question. Some archaeologists see the settlement's wall as evidence of organized conflict emerging alongside permanent life. Others emphasize environmental management and flood control instead. Skeletal evidence for warfare in early Jericho remains limited and open to interpretation. Did the inhabitants fear raids from neighboring groups? Was the wall partly psychological, defining communal identity more than defending against constant attack? No single explanation fully accounts for the structure. Disease presents another hidden mystery. Dense permanent settlements change patterns of illness dramatically compared to mobile hunter-gatherer life. Crowding, food storage, waste accumulation, and close contact with domesticated animals all increase opportunities for infection. Yet prehistoric diseases rarely leave clear traces archaeologically unless they affect bones directly. Entire epidemics may have swept through Jericho without leaving obvious evidence behind. The emotional life of the settlement remains even harder to reconstruct. What did it feel like to belong to one of humanity's earliest permanent communities? Did residents experience pride in the walls surrounding them, anxiety during drought years, claustrophobia inside dense housing clusters after generations of more mobile ancestry? The archaeological record offers glimpses but never full answers. Children buried beneath house floors suggest powerful family attachment. Plastered skulls imply emotional continuity with the dead. Repeated rebuilding after collapse reveals resilience and commitment to place. But the inner psychological world of Jericho's inhabitants remains largely silent. That silence creates a strange effect at the site today. Modern visitors stand atop the mound looking across the Jordan Valley while trying to imagine lives almost impossible to visualize completely. The landscape still carries echoes of the ancient environment: harsh light, dry wind, distant mountains, palms near water. Yet the human world that once surrounded the spring has vanished so thoroughly that only fragments remain. Time feels unusually deep at Jericho. Most historical places belong to civilizations already recognizable to modern audiences. Rome resembles later cities. Medieval castles resemble familiar political systems. Jericho's oldest layers belong to a world before almost every institution modern humans associate with civilization. No writing, no money, no formal states, no historical records. And yet people are already building monuments, organizing labor, storing food, managing dense populations, and reshaping landscapes permanently. Jericho forces an uncomfortable realization: the foundations of civilization emerge long before civilization itself fully exists. There is also a philosophical mystery buried within the site. Why do human beings become sedentary at all? Older narratives often portrayed settlement and agriculture as obvious improvements over mobile life. Modern anthropology paints a more complicated picture. Hunter-gatherer societies can be healthy, socially sophisticated, and environmentally flexible. Early agriculture often increases labor demands while narrowing diets. So why stay? Why accept harder work, disease risk, territorial conflict, and social tension in exchange for permanence? Scholars still debate these questions intensely because the transition was likely driven by multiple overlapping forces: climate instability, population growth, ritual gathering traditions, resource concentration, social competition, and simple human attachment to familiar places. Jericho may exist because enough people chose belonging over mobility, and once enough generations were born beside the spring, leaving became emotionally difficult even when conditions worsened. This emotional gravity might explain why the settlement repeatedly returns after periods of collapse. The oasis is not merely useful land, it becomes inherited memory. Ancestors are buried there. Stories are tied to specific houses and paths. Human identity fuses gradually with geography. Perhaps that is the deepest mystery of Jericho. Not how the wall was built or why the tower rises so early, but why human beings decide again and again across thousands of years to remain together in one place despite everything permanence costs them. Today, modern Jericho still lives beside the same ancient spring. Cars move through streets where prehistoric hunters once walked carrying stone tools. Palm groves continue rising from the valley floor. Irrigation channels cut through the landscape much as water management shaped life here thousands of years ago. The oasis remains green against the surrounding dryness, still performing the same quiet miracle that first drew human beings to this place near the end of the Ice Age. Very few cities on Earth can say this. Most ancient settlements survive only as ruins abandoned to dust and silence. Jericho is different. The chain of occupation stretching across the site is so long that the distinction between prehistory and history almost collapses entirely. Human beings have returned here continuously through climatic disasters, cultural revolutions, imperial conquests, religious transformations, and technological ages beyond anything the settlement's first inhabitants could have imagined. And beneath the modern city, the older worlds remain layered below. The tower still stands in partial ruin at Tel es Sultan, older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, older than nearly every monument commonly associated with ancient civilization. Nearby lie traces of homes where some of the first settled communities in human history learned how to live permanently together. Beneath those layers rest the buried dead, the plastered skulls, the grinding stones, the forgotten pathways worn smooth by countless footsteps. The site feels less like one city than a compressed history of humanity itself. Jericho survives because it occupies a threshold between necessity and memory. The spring guarantees practical value, but practical value alone does not explain 10,000 years of return. Human beings continue rebuilding here because landscapes can acquire emotional gravity over generations. Ancestors become tied to place. Stories accumulate. Ruins themselves attract settlement because they mark known survival. This pattern repeats throughout civilization later. Cities rise near rivers, springs, crossroads, fertile valleys, and coasts because geography offers opportunity. But over time, those places become more than strategic locations. They become inherited worlds people struggle to abandon even during catastrophe. Jericho may be one of the earliest examples of that deeply human attachment. The settlement also reveals how fragile civilization has always been. Modern societies often imagine urban life as the natural and inevitable condition of humanity. Jericho tells a different story. Permanent settlement is an experiment difficult, unstable, and costly from the beginning. The first generations who gathered beside the oasis did not step smoothly into progress. They entered a new world filled with labour, disease, environmental vulnerability, social tension, and uncertainty. And still they stayed. The walls of Jericho symbolize this contradiction perfectly. They represent security and fear at the same time. They show confidence in permanence while revealing anxiety about collapse. Every city built afterward inherits the same tension. Urban life allows extraordinary cooperation, memory, creativity, and technological development. It also creates fragility on enormous scales. The people of Jericho discover this earlier than almost anyone else. Their settlement repeatedly contracts and recovers across millennia because no civilization remains stable forever. Climate shifts, trade systems change, political powers rise and disappear, earthquakes shake the valley. Yet the oasis continues pulling human life back toward it, because water remains essential even when societies fail. There is something deeply humbling about Jericho's age. The gap separating modern humanity from the builders of the earliest tower is immense, yet not as immense as it first appears. Those prehistoric inhabitants already understand cooperation, memory, ritual, architecture, inheritance, and fear. They mourn their dead. They organize labor collectively. They reshape landscapes to support permanent communities. In the deepest sense, they're already us. The distance between Jericho's first settlers and the modern world is technological, but emotionally the connection feels much smaller. Human beings still gather around resources, defend territory, preserve memory, bury ancestors, fear collapse, and rebuild after disaster. Civilization's foundations remain surprisingly unchanged. Perhaps this is why Jericho rarely occupies the same place in public imagination as Egypt, Rome, or Mesopotamia. The site is too old to fit comfortably into ordinary historical storytelling. It belongs to a period before kings, before empires, before written memory. Its greatest achievements emerge from silence. No heroic chronicle survived from early Jericho. No ruler commissions monuments celebrating conquest. No inscription explains the meaning of the tower or the faces beneath the floors. The city simply exists, layer after layer, carrying humanity slowly across one of the greatest transitions in history. Archaeologists continue studying the mound because every excavation still raises new questions. Advanced dating methods refine timelines. Microscopic evidence reveals forgotten details about crops, climate, and diet. Researchers debate how urban life truly began and whether Jericho should be considered a city in the strictest sense. But regardless of terminology, the settlement preserves something undeniable, one of the earliest known places where human beings committed themselves to permanence on a large scale. That commitment changed the world. From communities like Jericho eventually come states, writing, organized religion, trade empires, monumental architecture, law, warfare, bureaucracy, and nearly every structure shaping modern civilization. None of those later developments are visible fully in the earliest layers of the mound, yet their roots are already there beside the spring. The oldest city nobody talks about is not forgotten because it lacks importance. It is forgotten because its story begins before history learned how to remember. And still the oasis remains. Morning sunlight crosses the Jordan Valley exactly as it did thousands of years ago. Water continues rising from underground stone. Palm leaves move in the desert wind. Visitors walk above buried worlds without fully grasping how many lives lie beneath their feet. Jericho survives not as a monument to perfection, but as proof of endurance. Human beings came here at the edge of the Ice Age searching for stability in an uncertain landscape. They built homes, walls, rituals, and memories beside a spring in the desert. Civilizations rose above them and vanished after them. Yet somehow the city endured long enough for modern humanity to uncover its buried beginnings and recognize, within those ancient layers, the first outlines of ourselves. The valley grows quieter toward evening. Heat fades slowly from the stone and earth around the old mound while shadows lengthen across the oasis. Palm trees darken against the fading sky. Water still moves through the spring as it always has, indifferent to the rise and fall of every civilization that ever gathered beside it. Somewhere beneath the ground lie the remains of the first families who chose to stay here permanently. Their homes are gone now. Their languages vanished thousands of years ago. The names of their children disappeared before writing even existed. Yet traces of their lives remain preserved in layers of ash, plaster, grain, and stone. That may be the strangest thing about Jericho. The city survives not because its people conquered the world or left behind empires, but because they endured long enough in one place for memory itself to accumulate. Every rebuilt wall added another layer. Every burial beneath a house tied human life more tightly to the oasis. Every season of survival carried the settlement further away from the old wandering world and deeper into something new. Civilization begins quietly there, not with kings, not with armies, not with monuments carved full of victories, but with ordinary people waking before sunrise to grind grain beside a spring in the desert. The first inhabitants of Jericho could not know what their experiment in permanence would eventually become. They did not imagine future cities filled with millions of people, or empires stretching across continents, or modern archaeologists digging through the remains of their homes 10,000 years later. They were solving immediate problems: water, shelter, hunger, memory, fear. And yet from those practical struggles came the foundations of nearly every settled society afterward. The mound at Tel es Sultan now holds the compressed weight of all those forgotten generations. Wind moves softly over collapsed stones older than history itself. Visitors stand above ruins that predate the pyramids by thousands of years and often leave surprised by how ancient the place truly feels. Not dead ancient, human ancient. Jericho reminds us that civilization has always been fragile, improvised, and unfinished. Cities rise because people believe tomorrow can still be built in the same places today. They survive only as long as communities continue repairing walls, carrying water, storing food, and choosing not to leave. For 10,000 years, beside one stubborn spring in the Jordan Valley, human beings kept making that choice. And because they did, the oldest city nobody talks about still remains there beneath the desert light, waiting quietly at the beginning of the human story.